My mother-in-law told me to leave her son. She had no idea I owned everything she wanted, and then I always knew Dorothy didn't like me. She smiled with her lips, never her eyes, and every compliment she ever paid me came coated in the sugary tone of someone who couldn't wait to twist the knife once I turned away. Still, I had no reason to believe she would cross the line she did, not until the day she told me, without hesitation, without shame, that I should leave her son. It was one of those late October Sundays in Savannah, the kind that felt like summer refusing to die quietly. Sunlight spilled through the arched windows of our dining room as I cleared plates from the long oak table. The smell of fresh biscuits and honey still hung in the air. Everyone had finished eating, and the polite, meandering conversations had turned to talk of upcoming holiday plans. I was placing a stack of silverware back on the sideboard when Dorothy slid up next to me, her voice soft, coated in faux concern. "Helen, dear," she said in that practiced southern drawl, the one she only used when she wanted to sound gentler than she really was. "Let's not draw this out any longer. You need to leave my son." The fork in my hand suddenly weighed more than it should have. Across the room, Preston, my husband, was laughing at something his father said about one of the neighbors' new boats. He was so casual, so unaware of the bomb his mother had just dropped in the very house she believed she owned. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Dorothy, assuming my silence meant agreement, pressed on, adjusting the diamond tennis bracelet around her wrist. "You've had your fun," she said smoothly, her lips curling at the edges. "But really, you must see it, don't you? You're not the right fit for this family. You never were." I had heard versions of this before, quiet jabs about my parents, comments about how my business was cute, the way she introduced me to her friends as Helen, Preston's wife, always skipping over who I actually was. But never had she said it so plainly. Today, the gloves were off. "You don't have the right name," she continued, her voice low, her tone patronizing. "No lineage. No real roots. A woman like you will always drag a man like Preston down." I set the plates down with careful precision. I exhaled slowly and turned my head, looking her square in the eye. She saw calm and mistook it for surrender. That would be her first mistake. "Don't look so surprised, dear," she added, clearly mistaking my silence for acceptance. "Preston will remarry. We'll find someone more appropriate, someone raised in the right circles. You understand, don't you?" I smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone breaking. It was the kind of smile you give just before delivering a fatal blow in a duel. Then, without another word, I walked away. No anger, no tears, no screaming. Just quiet exit, clean and precise. Let her think she'd won. That was the fun part. She didn't know that the house she adored so much, the one she bragged about to her friends, the one she thought was a legacy of her family's wealth, was mine. Bought with the earnings from a hospitality brand I built from the ground up long before I met her son. She never once asked how Preston could afford this house, why he never seemed to know how the taxes were paid or the renovations were approved. She assumed, like she always did, that Preston was the man she'd imagined into existence. The provider, the future patriarch, the one who upheld the name. She had no idea that her son's paycheck couldn't even cover the taxes on the back garden. That night, I said nothing to Preston. I didn't tell him about the conversation with his mother because, frankly, I didn't need to. While Dorothy schemed to push me out, she was standing in a house that I owned outright, in a marriage protected by a prenup she had once mocked without ever bothering to read. And everything, every inch of her imagined empire, rested on my patience. Over the next couple of weeks, Dorothy grew bold. She had tasted the idea of victory, and it clearly energized her. She began speaking to Preston in the kind of riddled concern that always masqueraded as love. "Helen just doesn't understand our world, sweetheart," she told him over lunch, her voice honeyed and poisonous. "Wouldn't you be happier with someone who fits in? It's not her fault, of course. She was raised differently." She didn't say less. She didn't have to. I watched it all happen from a distance. Preston, as usual, laughed it off. He never believed his mother was capable of true manipulation. He thought her stubborn, yes, but not conniving. He was wrong. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for, the final nudge. I had just stepped out of the guest room when I overheard them. Dorothy's voice, low and urgent, floated from Preston's office down the hallway. "She's not right for you," she was saying, her tone sharper now. "You've done enough. If you end it now, I'll make sure you walk away with everything." I almost laughed. Everything. She truly had no idea what belonged to who. That night, lying beside the man who unknowingly let his mother plan a quiet coup against our marriage, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel hurt. I felt entertained. They had already lost. Neither of them knew it yet. The first crack appeared at breakfast the next morning. Preston sat across from me, sipping his usual espresso, staring at his phone like always. I watched him like I had 1,000 times before. He looked up, a hint of concern in his eyes. "You're quiet this morning," he said. "Everything okay?" "Everything's perfect," I answered, and it was. Because I had made my decision. I wouldn't fight. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't defend myself to a man who didn't see the war his own mother had declared on his life. I was going to let them dig their grave with their bare hands. And then, when they were finally ready to throw the dirt over me, they'd realized too late. They were burying themselves. By mid-afternoon, I got the first text. It was from Dorothy, of course. Short, gloating. "Preston and I had a lovely lunch today. He agrees. It's time to move forward." I let it sit. I wanted her to believe she was in control. Let her ride that high. 2 hours later, another ping. "I hope you understand, Helen. This is best for everyone." "No, Dorothy. It was best for you." But I responded, just as sweetly. "I understand perfectly." And I did. They had no idea the clock had already started ticking. That evening, when Preston came home, his hesitation in the doorway told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't the kind of man to wrestle with decisions for too long, but the guilt written across his face was heavier than anything I'd seen him carry since our wedding. He walked in slowly, like someone arriving at a funeral they didn't know they were attending, and paused as I folded a blanket on the couch. "Hey," he started, his voice tentative, his eyes unsure. "Can we talk for a minute?" I nodded, already knowing every word before he spoke it. I sat on the couch, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for him to begin the performance he had no idea was rehearsed by 100 men before him. "I think," he said, taking a breath, "I think we should spend some time apart." I tilted my head, letting my face register something that could have passed for mild surprise. He needed to believe I hadn't seen it coming. He needed to believe I still saw him as the man I once married. "We want different things," he continued, avoiding my eyes, repeating words I knew Dorothy had likely drilled into him like lines for a play. "You know how it's been lately." I nodded again, saying nothing. He kept going, perhaps confused by my silence, or expecting some tearful protest, some bargaining. "I mean, it's not about blame or anything. It's just, maybe some space would help. I still care about you, of course." "Of course," I replied softly. He blinked. That wasn't the response he wanted. He was ready to argue with me. He had braced for resistance. He had steeled himself for a storm. And here I was, calm as glass, giving him nothing but a smooth nod and a soft tone. "You're not upset?" he asked finally, the nervous energy now creeping into his hands, rubbing his palms together like a man trying to erase what he just said. "Why would I be upset?" I said, standing up slowly. "You've made your choice, and I respect that." I walked into the bedroom and pulled a suitcase from the closet. Preston followed me, confused, faltering in his steps. "I didn't mean tonight," he said, voice rising just a little. "You don't have to leave right this second. I want to give you space," I said as I began folding clothes with precision. "That's what you asked for, right?" He stood in the doorway, helpless and confused, as I packed a bag and closed the zipper. Let him believe I was heartbroken. Let him think I was surrendering. Let him enjoy his hollow little victory while it still felt like one. That night, I checked into the Victoria Grand, Dorothy's favorite hotel in the city, the one she loved to parade through in her sequin gowns at every fundraising gala. She'd once bragged about hosting the governor's wife there. I ordered a bottle of champagne to my suite and sat by the window, watching the city twinkle beneath me like I owned it, which, in many ways, I did. Tomorrow morning, Dorothy would wake up triumphant, convinced her plan had succeeded. Preston would feel relieved, thinking he'd handled everything maturely. Neither of them would realize just how completely they had stepped into the trap they set for me. The texts started again just after dawn. The first was Dorothy, dripping with smug satisfaction. "Thank you for being so understanding, Helen. Preston needs time, and I think this will be good for everyone." Good for everyone. The arrogance was suffocating. I didn't reply. By mid-morning, another message followed. "I hope you're settling in somewhere nice. We can arrange for the moving company once Preston decides the next steps." I laughed out loud. Right there in the plush king bed, silk robe wrapped around me, the scent of espresso from room service filling the air. She was already planning my erasure, already imagining a new, curated future where I never existed. I responded just before noon, after my second cappuccino. "Don't worry, I've made arrangements. You won't need to lift a finger." Dorothy probably read that and took it as a final gesture of grace. Let her. The less they suspected, the sweeter the impact when the truth landed. That afternoon, I instructed my lawyer to prepare the next phase. Everything we had discussed months ago was already in place, filed, verified, airtight. The house, the vehicles, the savings account, they all sat under my name, protected by documents that Preston had signed without question years ago. He never asked. He trusted me. Or maybe he just assumed he'd never need to know. A few days passed, and Preston still hadn't contacted me directly. Not a single call, not even a message to ask how I was doing. I assumed Dorothy had convinced him to let her handle everything, to be clean about it, to be civilized. That was her word, always. Civilized. As though manipulation wrapped in pearls and politeness wasn't still poison. Then came the call from my lawyer late that Friday afternoon. "She's been contacting the title office," he said. "Apparently, she tried to inquire about transferring property documentation." I smiled and stirred my drink. "And they wouldn't speak to her," he said, amused. "Her name isn't listed anywhere. Not on the deed, not on the mortgage, not even as a point of contact." Of course it wasn't. Dorothy had spent so much time treating me like the unwanted visitor that she never once imagined I was the architect of everything she envied. Saturday morning brought the next wave of chaos. Preston called. 3 missed calls in a row. Then finally, a message. "Helen, something's wrong. I called the bank and they said the mortgage isn't in my name. Can you call me back?" I let it sit unanswered. By nightfall, his tone shifted. The next text had a different edge to it. "Why would you put the house in your name? I don't understand what's going on." Of course he didn't. He never bothered to ask. Never questioned why I was the one who met with the accountant every spring. Never cared to know how the taxes were paid, how the renovations were financed, how the business I started from a single studio suite now owned 4 boutique hotels across 3 states. He assumed, like Dorothy, that I played a supporting role in the movie of their lives. And now they were both standing on a set that was built, lit, and paid for by the woman they thought they could write out of the script. I went for a walk that night, past the quiet squares of Savannah where wrought iron fences wrapped around grand homes that looked like postcards. I passed a familiar street, saw a couple on their porch sipping wine, laughing. They looked free. For the first time in months, I realized. I felt free too. Preston was unraveling. Dorothy would be next. And I hadn't raised my voice once. It was the following evening when the first message came from Dorothy herself, this time through my lawyer, not a direct line. She was furious. The bank had confirmed what she couldn't believe. Her son wasn't on the mortgage. And worse, there was no legal recourse to claim a single brick of the estate she had once considered the crown jewel of their family's heritage. She had called the bank, demanded to speak to someone who understood the situation, and had been promptly and firmly shut down. Her shrill reaction had caused more than one department head to take notes. I was in my suite when I received the update, a tray of fruit and cheese untouched beside me, my phone buzzing softly. My attorney's message was short, but the satisfaction behind it was unmistakable. Dorothy called. "She's just now realizing the house is entirely yours." I believe her words were, "This can't be happening." I imagined her pacing in their outdated sunroom, still decorated in the same stiff creams and cold marbles she swore were timeless, shouting into her phone, insisting there had been a clerical error, that someone had forgotten to list Preston's name. In her world, It wasn't just offensive, it was impossible. I sipped my tea and let the warmth run through me slowly. The next day, they asked for a meeting. They didn't phrase it as a request, of course. Dorothy phrased it like a summons, as though I still owed her the courtesy of being ordered around. My lawyer called me first thing in the morning. "She's insisting you explain yourself," he said. "She wants to meet at the house." "Perfect," I replied, already planning my outfit. I arrived just before sunset, when the golden light hit the windows just right and made the whole property glow. It was the hour Dorothy always chose to entertain, when the house looked like something out of a magazine. I pulled into the driveway slowly, deliberately, watching as Preston stood near the porch steps, arms folded, jaw tight. Dorothy stood beside him, her usual rigid posture now slightly hunched, like the weight of what she had learned was beginning to drag her down. I stepped out of the car calmly, closed the door with care, and walked up the path with a poise I knew she would recognize as intentional. Let her see how little I had broken. "We need to talk," Preston said immediately, stepping forward like he still had any say in how this was going to go. "Do we?" I asked, raising an eyebrow but keeping my tone even. "There's been some confusion," Dorothy said quickly, brushing past him, always eager to take charge when the narrative slipped from her grasp. "The bank says the house is in your name. That can't be right." "It's not a mistake," I said clearly, watching her expression collapse by fractions. "It's exactly as it's supposed to be." Preston looked like he'd swallowed a stone. "But we lived here together," he said, almost pleading, like the fact that he had shared my bed and eaten meals under this roof should count as some form of legal currency. "And I let you," I replied, my voice soft but razor-sharp. Dorothy flinched. She had never once heard me speak to Preston like that. Until now, I had always played the role, polite, composed, supportive. But that woman was gone, packed up and sent away with the boxes I had left in the guest bedroom. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising. "You're nothing without my son. You never had anything before him." I tilted my head, gave her a measured look, and replied in the same calm tone I'd used all week. "I had everything before him, and I still do." Preston ran a hand down his face, his fingers pressing into his temples like he was trying to press back the weight of the moment. His confidence, so casual days ago, was now crumbling beneath the truth. His voice, when it returned, was thinner. "Helen, let's just talk this through. Maybe we can work something out." "Oh, Preston," I said, almost laughing, "we already worked something out. That's why you signed a prenup." Dorothy gasped, an actual gasp, the sound of someone watching their fortress collapse in real time. Preston stood frozen, and in the silence that followed, I saw their world crack open. I stepped back, the concrete cool beneath my heels, and watched them both as they tried to make sense of it all. Dorothy looked stunned, grasping at phrases that never made it past her lips. Preston was pale, almost sick, like he had finally realized the cost of handing over his judgment to a woman who only ever saw people in terms of usefulness. "You wanted to be free of me," I said, my voice quiet but unshakable. "Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted." And then I turned to leave, stepping off the porch and toward my car. I didn't move quickly. I didn't run. I wanted every step to land. Behind me, I heard Dorothy sputter. "You tricked him. You manipulated my son into signing something he didn't understand." I paused at the driver's side door, looked over my shoulder, and smiled. "You mean the document he signed willingly, the one that clearly outlines that all premarital assets remain mine, including the business, the house, and every cent that came from my work?" Preston opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but I lifted my hand and stopped him. "Tell me, Preston," I asked, "did you ever even read it? Or did you just assume it wouldn't matter?" He didn't respond. That told me everything I needed to know. Dorothy's face was flushed now, blotchy red patches blooming across her cheeks. Her breath came in short bursts. She wasn't just angry, she was unraveling. "You're doing this out of spite," she hissed. "You're tearing this family apart because of your pride." "No," I said, walking back to the car and opening the door. "I'm letting you choke on the consequences of your own arrogance." She took a step forward, full of old fire, The kind she used to intimidate new neighbors or low-ranking socialites at garden club luncheons. You were never good enough for us, she spat. I stepped toward her, just once, looked her dead in the eye, and replied without blinking. And yet, somehow, it's still my name on the deed. She froze. Her lips parted, no sound coming out this time. That was new for Dorothy. Preston reached out, grabbing my wrist gently, desperation finally showing through the cracks in his polished facade. Helen, please. We can fix this. I was wrong, okay? I let her get in my head. But we can fix this. I looked at his hand, then back at him. There was a time that touch might have meant something. Now it felt like the last thread from a life I had already walked away from. You don't get to play the victim now, I said. Not after what you chose. Not after what you let happen. He dropped his hand, and I could see the defeat begin to settle into his shoulders. He had thought he could stand on a foundation he never built and still call it his own. Now he was finally seeing the truth. You and your mother wanted me gone, I said. So I gave you exactly what you asked for. Now tell me, Preston, why don't you look happy? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. You think this is over? Dorothy snapped, almost shrieking now. I turned to her one last time. It is over, I said. You just don't want to accept that you lost. Then I got into my car, turned the key, and drove away from the house I still owned, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their own undoing. 2 days passed before I heard from either of them again. I had expected silence, maybe an awkward attempt at an apology, possibly even one of Dorothy's signature regretful but firm notes dressed up in crocodile tears and passive-aggressive self-pity. What I got instead was a text from her, as venomous as ever, though this time laced with desperation thinly veiled as confidence. You may have the house, she wrote, but don't delude yourself into thinking you've won. My son will recover. He'll find someone better, someone who actually belongs in this family. Enjoy your little empire while it lasts. I sat on the balcony of my suite, the city skyline reflecting off the glass in deep golds and blues, the air warm and humid as it wrapped around my skin. I sipped my coffee and smiled, not because of her words, but because even now, she still didn't understand that I hadn't just walked away. I had ascended. She believed her son was some sort of prize, that her approval gave value to the life I had built, that I would crumble without their presence or their last name to cling to. The reality was so far from her fantasy, it was almost comedic. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Life had a way of delivering consequences all on its own, and Dorothy was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Not because of anything I did to her, but because of what she did to herself. It was less than a week later when the first real crack appeared in her illusion of control, and it didn't come from me. It came from the corporate world she thought would line up to welcome Preston with open arms. A former colleague of his reached out to me, someone I barely knew, but who had always been respectful. She had heard about the separation through the social grapevine and decided to share something with me privately. I thought you should know, she said, voice low and cautious. Preston's no longer with the company. Apparently, your mother-in-law tried to step in, tried to secure his future by going straight to his boss. It backfired badly. I blinked, unsure whether to laugh or sigh. I chose silence and let her keep going. She barged into the office, demanding they promote him, talking about how he deserved more given everything he's been through. HR was already monitoring him for underperformance, and her little stunt gave them the perfect excuse to cut him loose. They're calling it a breach of decorum, but it's really just an overdue consequence. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat back in my chair, letting the weight of what I'd just learned sink in. Preston had lost his home, his security, and now he had lost the one thing Dorothy insisted made him superior, his career. And the best part? I hadn't lifted a finger. It was Dorothy's overreach, her obsession with status, her inability to let her grown son live without her claws in every decision, that finally tipped him into free fall. She had spent years trying to protect him from reality, only to catapult him straight into it the second she took full control. When Preston finally called me, I let it ring. Then it rang again, and after that came the text. Helen, please. I need to talk. I don't know what to do anymore. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity has a way of poking at quiet resolve. I called him back. His voice cracked on the first syllable of my name. Helen, I messed up. I know that now. I didn't say anything. I just let him sit with the silence. I thought, he continued, I thought it would be different. I thought. She knew what she was doing. You thought your mother was right, I said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. He didn't deny it. Yeah, he whispered, and the sound of that single word told me everything. I didn't mean to hurt you, he added, weaker now. But you did, I replied, letting it hang there long enough for him to feel the full weight of it. I didn't think it would all fall apart like this, he said, and in that moment I realized something that had been quietly taking shape for weeks. He wasn't grieving the loss of me. He was grieving the loss of the structure he had mistaken for a life. The house, the job, the image, none of it had been built by him, but he had worn it all like tailored armor. Now the pieces were scattered at his feet, and for the first time, he was seeing how little of it he ever truly owned. Can we meet? He asked, voice shaking. Just to talk. I closed my eyes. There it was, the last attempt to pull me back, not out of love, not out of regret, but out of fear. No, Preston, I said. We have nothing left to talk about. The silence on his end stretched into something raw and jagged. Please, Helen. Just a coffee. Just 5 minutes. Goodbye, Preston, I said softly and hung up. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought he might retreat, lick his wounds in silence, maybe learn something about the world he'd let his mother build around him. But Dorothy wasn't done embarrassing herself yet. 2 days later, she stormed into my office like she still had jurisdiction over my time. My receptionist barely had time to stand before Dorothy shoved past her and burst through the door, red-faced and fuming. This is your fault, she spat, slamming her hands on my desk. You've ruined him. You've destroyed everything. I didn't even flinch. I just sat back in my chair and looked at her like she was a misplaced guest at an event that no longer had her name on the list. What exactly is my fault, Dorothy? I asked calmly. You took everything from him. The house, the money, his job. I didn't take anything, I said, cutting her off. He gave it all away. She blinked like I had slapped her. Daniel chose to listen to you, I said. He chose to believe I was dispensable. He chose to walk out of something real for the fantasy you sold him. Her mouth opened, but I kept going. Tell me, when you promised him something better, did you even consider the possibility that you might be wrong? She didn't answer. She couldn't. I stood slowly, walking around the desk until I stood a foot in front of her. You built a man who never learned to stand without someone holding him up. And when it finally came time to walk on his own, he fell. That's not on me, Dorothy. That's on you. Her expression faltered. She looked older than I remembered, smaller too. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. You were never good enough for him. I leaned in slightly, met her eyes without blinking. No, Dorothy. I was too good for both of you. She stepped back like she'd been pushed, the truth of it hitting her square in the chest. Get out of my office, I said, my voice quiet but firm. She hesitated, one last flicker of defiance lighting her eyes. But it was hollow now. The fight in her had no teeth left. So she turned, walked to the door, and disappeared without another word. And as the door clicked shut behind her, I took a breath, a long, steady, satisfying breath, and let it fill every corner of my chest. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. After Dorothy stormed out of my office that day, the silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the kind that came from loss or grief, nor was it rooted in emptiness or isolation. It was peace, solid, clean, and uncompromised. No more whispered insults dressed in fake concern. No more strategic invitations to family dinners meant to remind me I didn't belong. No more walking into rooms where people had already decided who I was based on the woman they believed had built me. I didn't hear from Preston again. I didn't expect to. And honestly, I didn't need to. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes when you stop explaining yourself to people who only ever wanted to misunderstand you. When you stop apologizing for existing outside the roles they tried to force you into. When you stop shrinking just to fit inside their carefully curated world. And that's exactly what I did. I stopped. And everything, Every piece of my life that had felt strained suddenly began to bloom. The first morning I woke up truly free. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling in my new apartment, listening to the complete absence of tension. No passive-aggressive glances over breakfast. No unspoken weight in the air. No pretending to be softer so someone else could feel stronger. Just silence and light spilling through the curtains, and the gentle hum of a city that didn't know or care who Dorothy was. Business was better than ever. My brand continued to expand. We launched 2 more boutique properties in Charleston and Nashville, and a growing number of partners were reaching out, asking to collaborate. My name, mine alone, was on every lease, every contract, every asset. My team doubled. My voice carried weight in every room I walked into. No one questioned how I got there. They didn't need to. My results spoke louder than any last name ever could. People talked, of course. That kind of drama doesn't just vanish quietly. But most of the whispers weren't about me. They were about Preston, about the family that had once seemed so untouchable. The ones who had fallen from their imaginary pedestal without ever realizing how fragile it was to begin with. I didn't seek out those conversations, but they reached me anyway. One came from a woman I had barely spoken to during my marriage, a colleague of Preston's who stopped by my boutique one afternoon during an event. She smiled, leaned in, and said with a knowing tone, "You dodged a bullet." I gave her a polite laugh and turned back to the table of guests I actually cared about. I heard that Preston tried to rebuild. He applied for a few positions in smaller firms, but no one wanted to take the risk. Word gets around quickly, especially when a grown man shows up with his mother in tow. Dorothy's meddling, once hidden beneath cocktail dresses and foundation donations, was now public knowledge. People started distancing themselves quietly. Invitations stopped arriving. Her reputation, once upheld by the illusion of refinement, crumbled beneath the weight of her own ego. Then came the most unexpected moment of all. It was almost a year after I walked away from that house, after the confrontation, the exposure, the unraveling, when we hosted the anniversary party for the flagship boutique. It wasn't a huge event, just intimate enough to feel special. The kind of gathering that celebrated resilience without needing a spotlight. My team had arranged a beautiful evening. Soft lighting, jazz in the background, champagne flutes lining the shelves, and laughter bouncing off the walls. I wore emerald that night. Dorothy always said it wasn't my color. It looked perfect. About an hour in, as I was finishing a conversation near the entrance, I saw her, Juliana. The woman Dorothy had once hinted would be a better match for Preston. She hovered by the door, hesitant, scanning the room like she wasn't sure if she was welcome. She looked different, less polished, more real, a little uncertain in the way someone does when they know they're about to eat their words. When she finally approached, she didn't smile right away. She stood across from me with her hands clasped and said quietly, "I owe you an apology." I waited, not offering her anything, not because I was cold, but because I wanted her to say what she came to say. I believed her, she admitted. "Dorothy, I believed that you were the problem, that you were the reason Preston was so unhappy. I didn't see it then, but I see it now." I nodded slowly. She wasn't the first person to come to that realization, and she probably wouldn't be the last. "I saw what she did to him after you left," she continued. "How she controlled everything. How he let her. And I realized that could have been me." There was no bitterness in her voice, just quiet understanding. "You're lucky," I said finally. "You got out before it was too late." She exhaled and nodded. "I heard about your business. I wanted to see it for myself." I gestured around the boutique, the crown jewel of the empire I had built, the place she never would have imagined I could own. "Well," I said, a little smile tugging at my lips, "welcome to the little shop Dorothy tried to destroy." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "She underestimated you." "A lot of people did," I said. Later that evening, after everyone had gone and the lights had dimmed, I stepped outside alone. The streets were quiet, the buildings glowing under the orange halo of the city's street lamps. I looked up at the skyline, at the place I had once stared at through hotel windows the night Preston told me it was over. Back then, I was preparing for war. Now, I was standing in the peace that came after winning. Not because I fought harder, but because I refused to let their chaos rewrite my story. Dorothy had once told me that I wasn't good enough for their family. And maybe, in her twisted logic, she was right. I wasn't good enough for that family. I was better. Not because I had money or status or titles, but because I had the strength to walk away with my dignity and build a world where I never needed their approval to thrive. I never looked back. Not once. And the best part of it all, I didn't just survive what they did to me. I turned it into the foundation for everything I've become.